Derreck Bennett and Dying and Rising Gods. Do they really parallel Jesus? Well, you're going to want to watch this show. He's writing in a book that's coming out with John Loftus on a varieties of mythicism. Dr. Robert M. Price and a variety of other people will be authoring in this book, writing articles in this book. Make sure you guys go in the description, subscribe to his YouTube channel, check out his other stuff. He's got blog posts, you name it. And we at Mythvision now, we have a Patreon. You guys can go down in the description, join the Mythvision Patreon to help us do what we're doing. Make sure you subscribe, like, and make sure you comment down below your thoughts on whether or not Jesus is compared to dying and rising gods. The rejections we get even from non-believing scholars like Dr. Ehrman is, well, those are agricultural deities, or Jesus is authentic and Jewish in some way, and it makes him unique and not compared to pagan myths. Watch this show. Tell me what you think. And Derreck Bennett's a character, so I hope you guys like this. Make sure you show him and us some love. See you soon. We are Mythvision. Welcome back to the show. Derek Lambert, your host, Mythvision Podcast. Today we have Derek and Derek with you. What's up, Derreck Bennett? How you doing, brother?
Doing pretty well, brother. Yourself?
Doing good. I'm excited because today, from what I understand, the first time in history since the start of this whole thing, Christianity, you're actually going to disprove all these people who said that dying and rising gods, they don't parallel Jesus. And you're going to approach this in a way, I think, that no one else ever has. I think on air, if I'm not mistaken, you're literally going to kill yourself and then bring yourself back to life so that everyone knows that it's true.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Oh, this is good.
What I'll do for art.
Dude, this is awesome, man. So you wrote an awesome article. I briefly got to dig into it, and as I started reading the very first, if you don't mind, can I read this intro here and let people get a gist? Is that cool with you?
I guess, Derek. Whatever. It's your show.
All right. Dying and rising gods. Guys, how often have you heard it said by Christians and non-Christians or Christian sympathizers, Dr. Bart Ehrman and others, who are suggesting, listen, there's no parallel, you can't compare Jesus to the their approach, dying and rising gods that are out in the antiquity of the ancient world, and we can't do that. So here's what Derek has to say in the very beginning. You guys will definitely want to be checking that out because I suspect he's going to be publishing this at some point, fingers crossed, in the Journal of Higher Criticism with Dr. Price, and I think he'll definitely do that. Ever since Sir James Frazer published The Golden Bough, is that pronounced correct?
Mm-hmm. The Golden Bough, I believe.
Golden Bough.
I've not read very many books, but
it's okay. Right. I'd rather pronounce it correct.
Very poorly educated.
Me too. Cool. The Golden Bough in the late 19th century, there has been scholarly discussion and debate over the existence of a dying and rising god mythotype. Frazer proposed that various deities from antiquity were modeled after the yearly cycle of vegetation, undergoing death and resurrection in a symbolic portrayal of seasonal death and rebirth. The implications for Christianity were clear. Thus, the topic has never been without controversy. Religious and even secular scholars, including best-selling author Bart Ehrman, have challenged the concept on several grounds, most notably among them. And these are four important, if you will, points that they'll suggest when they're arguing this. Number one, the concept is wholly an invention of late 19th and early 20th century scholars, attempting to undermine the resurrection of Jesus. Number two, among the gods who are said to have died and risen, none of them rise bodily or return to the world of the living. Thus, they are not actually resurrected. Number three, some of the gods in question do not truly die. Thus, they are not raised from the dead. Number four, Christianity arose from a purely Jewish context, unsullied by pagan ideas. That's funny. From the surrounding Mediterranean world. I shall examine each of these objections as they apply to some of our strongest examples of dying and rising gods from the ancient world. I will also discuss the various ties that these divinities have with the Judeo-Christian religion, demonstrating the plausibility for their having served as a prototype for Christ. But first, let us begin with the notion that dying and rising gods are a fabrication of late 19th and early 20th century scholars. Now, I don't think I need to go on. I think we can talk for a while here, and if you want me to read more, I can always read more, or you can read more. It doesn't matter. But
Probably a good jumping off point, though. Yeah.
yeah. So what have you found, Derek? Just freestyle with me here. What is it that you found with people who make those claims? Like, are they absolutely wrong in your research? Like, you're like, come on, guys, why are you making this case like that? Why are you not seeing it?
Yeah, I mean, mostly you see these claims being made by Christian apologists for very obvious reasons. Um, they've never been comfortable with this idea of a dying and rising God mythotype. You'll hear them just deny this till they're blue in the face. But every now and then, you'll also have secular scholars like Bart Ehrman deny this just as vehemently for whatever odd reason. Um, I believe it was in around 1987 that going back. This began with James George Frazer and the Golden Bough, which was written, I want to say, toward the end of the late 19th century. It seems that he more or less introduced this idea to the public. And just as I said in the article, it's never been without controversy. You've had a lot of pushback. And Frazer, he might have been mistaken about some things as well. There are more scholarly, up-to-date sources and articles and researches on this. But yeah, of course, there's a lot of pushback, especially from evangelical circles for rather obvious reasons. It's just too darn threatening to the Christian faith to think that Jesus might just be a cookie cutter example of these earlier myths and archetypes and so forth. But the notion that this was something that was just invented whole cloth in the late 19th or 20th century is nonsense. And I begin in that portion of the article talking about how this was being discussed amongst some of the ancients way back when. Of course, you had early Christian apologists like Justin Martyr talking about these kinds of similarities, these parallels. Now, the interesting thing, the approach I take with this article is rather than just do another dying and rising gods bit, as you've seen done before, I am specifically taking on the objections raised by Christian apologists and those like Ehrman as well. But yeah, as far back as the second century, you had Christian apologists like Justin Martyr, Firmicus Maternus, Tertullian, and so forth discussing these similarities. And in the case of Justin Martyr, he's trying to send a message that they're being persecuted, and he's saying, look, don't kill us. What we believe is not at all that dissimilar from what you guys believe about various other deities who died and rose and ascended to heaven. So for the love of God, leave us alone. Stop killing us. And Christian apologists are good at understanding the context there, that's what Justin Martyr is trying to do. And of course, what they say is that he is stretching a little bit in order to make his point, which is not necessarily the case when you actually read the sources. I'm pretty sure the ancients had a pretty good idea of what people believed back in the day, better than we might. Yeah. And then, of course, you had, Celsus, second century philosopher. We know of his writings through, was it Origen that was quoting him against Celsus?
Origin.
I think it was Origen. And he's making a lot of these claims as well. The point is, people were talking about this stuff very early on. They were noticing these similarities and discussing these ideas, these parallels, these similarities. Whatever you want to say about it, it's clearly not something that was just someone pulled out of their butt here in the 19th or 20th centuries. We've known about this stuff for a long, long time. So it's just completely fallacious to make this claim. It's absurd that this was just invented whole cloth by by James Frazer or anyone else.
I actually, and I agree 100%. I mean, when you do read these early church fathers, yeah, they're covering their butt, hey, don't hurt me. Like, guys, look, we're not that different.
Right.
And of course, Christians will say that's just a tactic they're using to try and, like, the martyrdom and the persecution. Oh my gosh, they were so persecuted. Mandita Moss, I think, is a good book everybody should check out. But anyway, I'm not going to say that they weren't bullied on the block. I mean, you're taking this narrative, a Jewish concept, okay, a Jewish guy named Jesus, bringing it into a pagan world of people. And here you are, literally, and I love the work of like Dennis McDonald and others. I'm recently or soon going to be having Cam as well, Cam Spears on the show. Dennis McDonald's coming on tomorrow.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, with the mimesis criticism. And so he's going to show, like, hey, these are definitely Homeric epics, and the Aeneid, I can't even pronounce the term, the Aeneid, I can't even say it right, but the Roman version of the Homeric, stories. And we're going to show their parallels and then go into like Heracles and show where Heracles, like one of the interesting things I read in his book, interestingly enough right now, and I know this isn't Dying and Rising God yet, but there's some implications, I think, that one can start to see, Jesus does look very much like these other mythologies. He shows where Heracles has taken the Cerberus, the three-headed dog, to Hades, and he literally takes the story and applies it over here and shows in Mark. And I'm looking over Mark, and then of course he parallels Matthew and Luke, and where the transfiguration happens, the same language that is used where Heracles is like taking Cerberus down to Hades is similar language used where the transfiguration takes place, and he has Peter, James, and John join him. Three. You got the three-headed dog, okay, and then you have the three men, okay, and then they come up. So you can suggest, this is a parallelomania, Derek, but when you start looking at the language and you see the overlap, it's hardly undeniable. So the same can be said, I suspect, of Dying and Rising Gods. And I think one of the big criticisms, and I don't know if you cover this in this article, maybe I can get your thoughts on it, and we could just, if you don't have any thoughts, it doesn't matter. We can shoot whatever. One of the problems I find is they expect, unlike it's like when you get to Jesus, when you get to the New Testament, you better treat this thing differently than anything else. And so they expect this Jesus who died literally, who rose physically, according to them, in the narrative, physically from the dead in a certain manner in which there is this, this is unique and no one else. Well, what do you have to say to that? Because, I mean, Osiris, right? They're trying to put his body back together. She can't find, well, did she find his pecker, or can't remember, but
I think she found everything but the pecker.
She had to create a magic one or something.
Yeah, we don't know what happened to this poor pecker.
Damn. So what are your thoughts on that, though? The whole, like, they treat Jesus different. And I think even Dr. Carrier recently came on a show with Godless Engineer and Christopher Hansen and other guys who are historicists. And there was a historian with him as well. I think Craig Evans, I'm not sure. But he was kind of like poking at Dr. Carrier's stuff. And Dr. Carrier's like, the problem I'm finding is that people are treating Christianity as if it isn't, as if it's so like new, radical, different than anything else. And there is no, it's not built from other elements that make it what it is, that parallel other religious views. So I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Making perfect sense. Yeah. If you study Christianity, if you study the Bible, within the broader context of the ancient world, if you familiarize yourself with the various myths and legends and philosophies and so forth that were prominent back then, I mean, what you find is that it's precisely the kind of religious faith that we would expect to develop from that world, from the dominant ideas of that age. It's not going to have everything in common with everything else, just as any other religion, modern or ancient, isn't going to have everything in common with every other religion. But there are various aspects, there are various archetypes and so forth that very much belong to that time and place in antiquity. One of the things you discuss when you talk about Dennis MacDonald's work comparing the Gospels to the Homeric epics, I'm not actually familiar with MacDonald's work. I'd love to get into that as well. But that just goes to show you that a lot of these ideas that were prevalent in the Greek world, a lot of these ideas that were dominant during the Hellenistic age, of course, Christianity inherited many of those ideas, many of those beliefs, and so forth. It's funny how often we'll just kind of jump ahead more or less to that fourth objection, that Christianity came from this purely Jewish thought world, and it's completely, all Jews were just, they abhorred anything pagan, anything exotic, anything that wasn't strictly Jewish. They just weren't having it. Just that's such nonsense. One of the things I find myself thinking is, if Christianity were so thoroughly Jewish, why isn't it just Judaism? Why in the world did Christianity ever split off from its parent religion to begin with, if it's so thoroughly Jewish, as the apologists try to tell us? But this idea that they were completely somehow anesthetized, that they were just, it was unthinkable for them to inherit pagan ideas or thoughts from the Greek world, is utter nonsense. There were indeed plenty of Jews during the first century who were opposed to any kind of syncretism or taking part in religious practices or faith practices, rituals, and so forth from other religions from the Greek world. We know that to be the case, but we also know that they were so up in arms about this, like the Maccabees and so forth, precisely because that kind of thing was happening, because of the fact that there were so many Jews who were attracted to these ideas that were streaming in from the Greek world and so forth. For those who aren't familiar with the history, it was around the 4th century that Alexander the Great conquered half the known world. And as a result, different civilizations, different the Jews, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and so forth. This would prior to the Romans, but it's because of Alexander the Great's conquest that the world became more cosmopolitan. You had disparate cultures in contact with each other as had never been, as not anywhere near to the extent that they ever had been before. So Jews were exposed to Greek ideas and to ideas from other faith systems and so forth. And we have evidence that is the case, that you had, of course, you had Jews who were trying to think. Sorry, I'm brain farting here.
You're fine. You're fine.
No, you had, of course, Hellenistic astrology in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have examples of that. There were Jews that embraced the Platonic notion of an afterlife in terms of being a disembodied soul, a soul that is released from the prison of the body. You have this in Philo of Alexandria. You have it among the Essenes, the Therapeutai. Various, Josephus speaks about these groups as well. This was a Greek idea that many Jews inherited into their faith systems. So it's just not true that all Jews were opposed to or somehow immune to inheriting or adopting pagan or Greek religious ideas.
And that goes vice versa. I would suggest, I mean, and that I'm actually currently in works with some guys who are going to find examples. They're currently looking to find examples. And if you're watching this and you have these examples, comment down below. You can also email me, mythvisionpodcast@gmail.com. And, is always open to emails for anybody who has any information that they can maybe supply that can help us. But I'm looking for also in the opposite direction, where pagans who were interested in monotheism and interested in Judaism, I want that as well, because there's plenty of people that I currently am in discussion with who think it's a one-way street. They think that, well, only the Jews really like the pagan world, and that somehow no one was welcome into the Israelite religion and to become an Israelite except a biological descendant of Abraham. So this is a whole nother rabbit trail discussion we're not going to get into here, but nonetheless, I wanted to make a point about the whole dying and rising God agricultural aspect. Dr. Robert and Price debated William Lane Craig years ago. It's a wonderful debate. I think someone spilled a coffee on that floor, and the coffee was William Lane Craig. And Dr. Robert and Price brought his mop and literally cleaned the floor up. And the only thing I saw that William Lane Craig said, and at that time I did not know what I know now about a lot of things, was William Lane Craig laughed and used the 19th century argument and then says, this has been disproven. He made it seem so ridiculous. This is so absurd. And then he turns around and he goes, oh, these are agricultural dying and rising gods. He literally hit like your 4 points, like almost like he had them memorized. And it's like, you got a good memory, man. But Dr. Robert and Price, when he responded, he used examples, but he didn't say, hey, Christianity is also agricultural in some respects. Okay, there are agricultural hints of dying and rising God type theme there. Of course, if you take a methodology that the Gospels are history, you're never going to go, why are these parables talking about when, you reap and you sow and what's going on here? Or there are these teachings of what people call astrotheology or star mythology, and they look in the Gospels and they see, and then we're looking at the Gospels mainly, don't get me wrong. I mean, we can go to Paul, but Paul's different. We treat these fictional. They are fictional. However, they do play a part in the religion of Christianity. And in the gospel narratives, it seems like Jesus at some points represents the Son. Like there seems like this weird, he's a type of son, and the 12 could be the 12 months. And there's this weird theme. I'm researching more on this, but if this is the case, I could understand why you have seasons and you have, it is not the season now. You'll know. Here are the signs. He talks about things in a way that if you do look at them with that respect, you might catch Osiris. You might catch these other divinities, and it might not be as clear as, in March, here's what's going to happen. And then in April, no. But have you done any research on that, the agricultural stuff in any way, or?
Yeah, a lot of the, several of these dying and rising gods, for instance, Osiris, Baal, Dionysus, and so forth, they did more or less begin as personifications of these various, seasonal or, vegetative or solar cycles and so forth. The problem with this argument that comes from apologists is that they're only telling you half the story. They're just saying, oh, but these were agricultural faiths. Ha, 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 that's stupid. Well, no, your argument is stupid. You're just giving us half the story. Yes, they may have begun as personifications of these natural cycles and so forth, but they developed into something much more. Many of them became these sort of personal salvation cults or mystery religions, as you may have heard of. And Dr. Price does a great job discussing this and deconstructing Jesus, where he takes on the apologists on this very same topic when it comes to dying and rising gods and so forth. How a lot of these, the vestiges of what these cults originally represented in terms of the external, the nature aspects, those things began to kind of fall away. They were sort of forgotten as time went on, and they sort of evolved into something quite different. Just as as Baal or Osiris or Dionysus may have once represented the crop cycle or the Nile or whatever, eventually they came to represent man's sort of aspiration, or his yearning to be able to overcome death, to be able to be reborn spiritually or however so that he may live on, so that they may undergo these cycles sort of in continuity with nature. It's just that the problem with that argument is they're not giving you the full story. They're only giving you half of it. And of course you find vestiges, just as you were talking about, of this same kind of stuff in the New Testament. As you mentioned, Paul compares the whole notion of death and resurrection to the seed, which is planted and then sprouts anew. It has to die, a natural body, so that it can be reborn, a spiritual body, and so forth.
But
These
that's a literal
ideas are
seed.
there.
They're going to argue, you've heard the arguments. It gets old, actually. It's like,
Yeah.
really, guys, you can't even concede even that far. That's just an analogy. You're jumping to conclusions. And I mean, I totally agree with you. Like, why use those examples, if they're not pertinent? But
They'd like to think that symbolism is there just purely as coincidence. And given that symbolism was so inherent to these other mystery cults and various pagan faiths, probably not a coincidence. I mean, Christianity emerged within a Hellenistic milieu where these mystery religions were quite dominant, were quite popular. Their argument has to be, oh, it's all just coincidence. This is just mere symbolism. I'm not buying it. It's
me neither.
nonsense.
I once used to buy that. Anything to protect my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Ben's upstairs.
Yeah. So I started looking at these things and started realizing, I think there's a lot more to this that can be discussed. And you came along and I saw a post by you on Facebook, which if you are not familiar with Derreck, be sure to go check him out. Do you have anything written, like a book or something other than the recovery one that you have? Or
I have a couple of blogs. One of them is Atheologica, which is simply atheologica.wordpress.com. That's where I tend to do more serious stuff. And I also have Atheomedy, www.atheomedy.wordpress.com, which is more of a comedic take on things. I tend to think that I'm funny sometimes. That's where I do the sillier, more distasteful stuff.
that's what we like. We really like that now. Now, when we've grown up, we're like, okay, tell me nasty things. Tell me dumb stuff, But yeah, that'll be down in the description, you guys. You can check them out. But Derreck did this dying and rising God thing, and I said, oh, snap. So I also saw you discuss, and I had to make a post on it. And I'm sure you saw it and realized, hey, that looks similar to something I just wrote on the mummy. Okay, the mummy being wrapped. The idea of preservation of the body from the Egyptians. Did they have a physical resurrection that they thought maybe down the road that they were going to get?
Absolutely. You find you hear this time and time again that the Osiris resurrection was purely a spiritual resurrection, and that the Egyptians hoped to change they hope to have a spiritual life after death. This is actually not true. If you read some of the most recent work from actual Egyptologists, Mark J. Smith is a good example, Eric Honing, you'll find that they did absolutely believe in physical resurrection. The reason why the body had to be preserved is because they did believe that the body lived on in the afterlife. Now, they also believed that the body could take on different forms and so forth, the ka and the ba and whatnot. We won't get into all that necessarily, but the point of the fact of the matter is they did believe in a physical resurrection. And so when it comes to Osiris, for instance, you'll find that it's all about the physical reconstitution of the body. In fact, if you want to pull that up from the article, there's I think 3 or 4 different examples.
Let's see.
From, pyramid texts.
Okay, let me find it because I think Which, do you know how far down in the list that you gave it to me it is?
Actually, come to think of it, Derek, I can probably just pull this up myself.
That would work. The Egyptian Osiris.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm there now. But the New Kingdom period of Egypt saw its empire stretch, or
Yeah, I'm just going to read a couple of
go
these
ahead.
from the pyramid texts. Osiris awakes, the languid god wakes up, the god stands up, the god has power in his body, from the pyramid texts. Raise yourself, O king, receive your head, collect your bones, gather your limbs together, throw off the earth from your flesh, rise up, O king, for you have not died. Literally having to throw the earth off from his flesh. That's absolutely physical. Osiris, collect thy bones, arrange thy limbs, shake off thy dust, untie thy bandages. The tomb is open for thee, the double doors of the coffin are undone for thee, the double doors of heaven are open for thee, thy soul is in thy body, raise thyself up. And lastly, raise yourself because of your strength. May you ascend to the sky. May you have power in your body. So even as he ascends to the heavens, he is doing so bodily. Between standing up, having power in your body, shaking the earth off from your flesh, the doors of the tomb opening, this is absolutely a physical resurrection. Now, what they like to say to this is that, Osiris goes on to the realm of the dead. Thus, that's not a resurrection like what you have in the case of Jesus, who actually comes back to the world of the living, to the earth. Well, you can point that distinction out if you're talking about the sort of the later development, the depiction of Jesus's resurrection in the Gospels. But the earliest Christians seem to have believed in and preached a Jesus who was raised directly to heaven. It wasn't this two-step process where he's first raised to earth and then he later ascends to heaven. In the Pauline Corpus, there's a great study on this by A.W. Zweig, The Ascension of the Messiah in Lucan Christology. You can also find Bart Ehrman espousing this same view and how Jesus became God, and various other scholars, that among the earliest Christians, I think it's Ephesians, talks about the mighty strength God exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at the right hand of God in heaven. I'm paraphrasing there. That may or may not be correct. But the point is, the earliest Christians believed that Christ was raised from the dead and that he was taken up directly into heaven. There's no mention of any kind of earthly sojourn in between in the Pauline Corpus. Now, a lot of apologists will say, but 1 Corinthians 15 discusses the appearances of Jesus to various people after his resurrection. Well, those appear to actually be visionary experiences. The Greek word that is used there, it can actually mean either a physical appearance of someone or just a heavenly appearance, like what you have with the angels and so forth. This appears to be a visionary experience, and the thing that tips us off to the fact that that's what it is rather than being a physical appearance is that Paul includes himself in the list of those to whom he appeared. And what do we know, from Paul's experience of seeing the risen Jesus,
Right.
whether you're talking about Acts or Paul's very brief descriptions in his own letters? This was not the physical body of Jesus, but it was a manifestation of the Jesus who had already been raised to heaven and was appearing to those on earth. So this is not necessarily an earthly sojourn. These are, again, visionary experiences, sightings of the risen Lord as he appeared already from having been raised to heaven. So the distinction they try to make between Osiris and Jesus or any other divinity who was simply, their resurrection was simply a being raised bodily to the heavens, the distinction's not there as far as the way resurrection was depicted among the earliest Christians. Sure, it evolves, it's different in the Gospels, but if Paul is able to say that Christ's resurrection is indeed a resurrection, then we can say the same for Osiris, for Heracles, for Asclepius, or any of the others for which that was also the case.
It's interesting you brought up 1 Corinthians 15, and just dumbing that down. I mean, if the nature in which Paul's visionary experience of Jesus is this experience that isn't literally earthly, why equate your view to their view? That's one way of looking at it. And another thing that Dr. Price did in that debate with William Lane Craig, which was way over. This is the problem that I had with the Ehrman debate. Okay. And I tell this to people all the time. Okay. Ehrman was very, how to put this? He was sharp and smart in his debate with Price. He dummied down everything.
Yes.
I mean, I'm talking,
yes.
the guy made it so easy to understand what he was trying to say and simplified. He even, in my opinion, made some assertions that to me are just not good arguments. Like the most attested for historical figure of the first century, because we have so many fictional gospel writings about the guy. It's like, hold on. Name outside sources. Don't use the actual biblical narrative or the New Testament narrative as your sources to suppose we have no other person more attested. Come on. So what I'm saying is he made arguments like an apologist would, except he wasn't a believer doing it. And Dr. Bob was very technical, which made it very difficult for anyone who's watching that to think that Dr. Bob may have won or Dr. Bob had really had arguments over Ehrman's case. And
Right.
one thing he did even in the debate, which I'm glad he tackled other things more simply, Dr. Price did, but he took 1 Corinthians 15 and showed that this is a creed and that this creed is a developed concept. This is not something that's like, oh, 1 Corinthians 15 was just written here and it was already there. He showed that it had molded as well. So even if one wanted to make the case, oh, look, no, 1 Corinthians 15, they could have still had a different type of vision than Paul himself, and it still could have been called an appearance that Paul's just, you can't make that argument or whatever. I think Dr. Bob does a good job of showing and expressing the best he could, even though William Lane Craig tried to make him look silly, was that this thing was probably tampered with 4 or 5 times before we have it in the version it is right now.
Right.
And there's no telling that could be interpolated up to a certain point in which this is a serious creed that Christians are already espousing about this movement. And he has his arguments and other critical scholars as to why this is not original. And let me tell you why. But just throwing it out there for anybody who might try to run there to make a case to try and argue against it. Dr. Bob's been looking at this stuff for a minute, and it's very hard. Can you imagine going uphill like him? He has to argue very complicated cases. And of course, he takes a different position on Paul than even Dr. Carrier. I mean, he thinks that these writings are all, they have evolved, tampered with. None of them are authentic, that there might be roots to it that are, but like the church has handled Pauline theology and has done things. So it's just interesting. Makes me wonder if there's a various sect of Gnostic concepts that this movement over here that's Pauline, and then here's the Gospels, and there's different movements all at once trying to do something here. Sorry, I had to wrap each other.
No, you're fine. I'm with you in that I saw the very same thing in that debate. By the way, I love Ehrman. I think he's a great scholar. I love reading his works. How Jesus Became God is one of the recent books of his that I read. I love following him on social media. I think he's a great scholar. I don't hate him. I just think he's strangely obstinate when it comes to mythicism, and of course in the dying and rising gods as well, because he wrote about that topic in Did Jesus Exist? You know, as far as mythicism goes, you and I had spoken earlier. I'm pretty agnostic on the matter. I don't drive a hard line either way. I think that those who look at mythicists as though they're like flat earthers, you know, or Roswell conspiracists, that's nonsense. They have some pretty solid arguments that need to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
They are not off their rocker. At the same time, I don't think anyone can be absolutely certain that there was no historical Jesus, but I think you also find that kind of nuance in most of the mythicists that you speak with. You know, and you know, there are historicists out there who I think make some pretty good arguments as well, but I don't see how you can have any kind, I don't see how you can dogmatize about it or be 100% certain on the matter as Ehrman postures as being.
Right.
That seems to be just as nonsensical to me. You know, to say that you're just absolutely certain one way or the other is crazy in my view.
Yeah, I think so, because the evidence is so convoluted. It's difficult to do that.
Right.
And then the historicist is like, dude, I entertain a historicist on this channel. I just recently had Lane Einhorn on the show. She's like, I am not a mythicist, and understand that. I'm like, yes, ma'am. Like, and I'm not against it. I'm like, yes, ma'am. You know, you go
Yeah.
ahead. She call me Lena. Oh, okay, okay. So she shows, you know, that she thinks that Jesus was this the Egyptian. That was her recent point, that she thinks that this guy in Josephus that literally goes to battle against the Romans on the Mount of Olives against the Romans and escapes the battle was the actual Jesus that the Gospels and you know, Paul's talking about, that is based off of. However, not to rabbit trail, and I'm not trying to throw anything under the bus, but she says that because I told her, I'm like, we got to do more shows on this about where you conclude this, and she goes, that's the problem, it consumes the other ideas that I have that are legit, like firm, because what I do is I speculate after this, and I'm like, I'm cool with speculation as long as everyone understands this is purely speculation. She thinks that maybe Paul himself is that Egyptian, and that
Hmm.
Paul is Jesus Christ. So technically the character that we see from the Gospels may very well, she says that she writes what's wrong with that idea, just like Dr. Bob, the Christ myth and its problems. He talks about what's good about it, what's bad about it.
Yeah.
She says, look, I write what's good about it. She's scholarly about it, but she thinks that Paul himself may be this Messiah guy. And he was a rebel and then ends up converting and being very pro Hellenized, very, very like peace loving, like let's not wage war anymore. It's an interesting theory, but when you use, in my opinion, and I'm not saying this isn't, you know, true, I'm not saying what you said isn't true, but when you use Gospels after reading something like Dennis MacDonald's Mimesis Criticism, it's so Homeric, it's so Iliad and the Odyssey, it's so the Aeneid. I can't even pronounce the damn, every time I try to say it. It's so much borrowing from other stories that you have to scratch your head, in my opinion, and go, is this like, where does the theology or the story meet history, and how do you know? And I think that that's where the historicist, some choose what they think's, you know, oh no, that's the real meat, and someone else who's a historicist might go, no, 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 that's still part of the fiction. This is the real meat,
And
and
it all seems so arbitrary.
yeah, yeah. So I'd
And of course, you
recommend
have
like
those who talk about Albert Schweitzer, who can't help, as Albert Schweitzer talked about, they can't help but produce a Jesus who all too often is reflective of them, you know, and
yes,
their own ideas and beliefs and philosophies. It's as much an exercise in psychology as it is supposedly in history. Uh,
yep,
so yeah, it is. You're right. It's so convoluted that it's hard to know what to think. And we can. I mean, of course, I'm here to primarily discuss Dying and Rising Gods. We could go
right.
on and on about the I don't know, the sort of strengths and weaknesses of mythicism and so forth. But it's a fascinating topic, and
Either way, though, you could still have a historical Jesus and still suggest that the Gospels, which are very fictional, are still characterizing a dying and rising God theme, and even goes so far as to
absolutely.
say, hey, there could have been a guy that was someone, you know, even though it does lend its weight in other areas as well as more than just historicity, it can lend its weight to mythicism, the dying and rising God theme.
Yeah, there are plenty of scholars who take that view. You know, Marvin Meyer, who wrote, he was an expert on, I think, the Gnostic Gospels, and he wrote a work called the Ancient Mysteries, a source book of sacred texts.
Hmm.
And he sort of, you know, he gathered together, collected all these various texts and literature from the ancient mystery religions and so forth. And that was certainly his view, was what, you know, that there was a historical Jesus, but he was deified and embellished along the lines of the, you know, the dying and rising gods and so forth. Of course, Rudolf Boltmann, that was a view of his as well. There are plenty of historicists who still think that the dying and rising God mythotype was very much applied, you know, to Jesus, you know, to Christianity. Um, one of the things you bring up, what again, I want to, with the Homeric epics, all too often you'll hear apologists say, but no, that's Greek, and you have to understand Christianity was Jewish. It comes from Judaism.
Right.
It's a prime example of the bifurcation fallacy. It's not an either or, it's a both and. It's both Jewish and Hellenistic. A good analogy would be, take the color green. um, you know, uh, Obviously that is related to the color yellow. If Christianity were the color green, then Judaism, could well be, by analogy, the color yellow. But there's also some blue mixed in there, and that would be Hellenism and these other exotic and pagan faiths and so forth. That's what syncretism is. Richard Carrier is very good at talking about this. He's got an article on dying and rising gods as well, which is very informative. And this happened quite often in the past, where various civilizations would come in contact with one another. Sometimes one civilization would come to dominate another, and they would absorb, or of course, or share religious beliefs. Judaism is very much, in the latter portions of the Old Testament, are very much informed by Persian Zoroastrianism. Back in the 6th century BC, of course, the Jews had been taken into exile by the Babylonians. It was Cyrus the Great and the Persian army who came in, and they defeated the Babylonians and freed the Jews from captivity. And of course, in the course of all that, Jews were very much exposed to Persian ideas and so forth. So a lot of these ideas that we find in later portions of the Old Testament, Ezekiel, Daniel, and so forth, and then on down the line in the New Testament and Revelation, these eschatological ideas or end times ideas, judgment, at the end of time,
resurrection, maybe
the resurrection of the dead and so forth, cosmic dualism, the battle between good and evil, God versus Satan. These were originally Zoroastrian or Persian ideas.
I even heard heaven and
absolutely
hell
heaven and hell. And a lot of what tips us off to some of these things, the actual name Pharisee, the etymology there is probably Farsi or Parsi, meaning Persian. That's probably not a coincidence. And Cyrus the Great is even spoken of in messianic terms in Isaiah, I think 44 through 45.
Yeah.
Again, they were able to venerate a pagan king. There's no reason why they couldn't venerate their pagan ideas as well.
And here's where I'm going to make a big leap, okay? And this is a big leap because it shouldn't be taboo to talk openly about discussions of ideas without people pointing fingers or going, how ridiculous, okay? There should be freedom of discussion of these things, and I feel like there's not. And I feel like Myth Vision, as much as people respect this program, because we do allow for these discussions, but as much as you see the Persian king being the messianic figure type, you see Josephus do the same for Titus. Vespasian, okay, the father and his son, as a Messiah, okay, a Messiah, literally like they did with Cyrus. Now, if Josephus, being a Jew, of course we know he was in their pocket. Of course he adopts the name, okay, of course, he's going to favor them. But it would, to me, the idea that there could be a Flavian connection in some way. I mean, the Gospels get written around the time Josephus is coming on the scene with his stuff. And there's implications in Luke and Acts that obviously are borrowing from Josephus, in my opinion, and other scholars have suggested. Then it wouldn't be too far of a stretch to say maybe there's something there as well, because it takes place, the Gospels portray, in my opinion, that the blame is on the scribes and Pharisees. They're constantly blaming these guys. Never openly do I ever hear them go, you damn Romans. No, like it literally is always, but in real history, the Messianic guys were thinking these freaking pagans, except there's this A and B. There's this yellow and blue, I think, a collaborative method, in my opinion, between certain Hellenized Jews, Israelites, if you will, and the pagan world, the Greeks, the Romans, etc., to collaborate an idea, what we call Christianity. It's a mystery school type concept, in my opinion, that there could be political implications here that tie into someone possibly going to, hey, there's your Messiah. Here's another king, just like Cyrus the Great. And here is the Vespasian. I'm not closed off to the Flavian concepts at all, even though I know everybody goes, hey, Atwell Parallelomania. Dude, I got so much respect for his book, even if I don't conclude all his stuff. I don't think it muddies the water to be open to ideas like this, in my opinion, even though everyone wants to go, this is why mythicists, they'll point at Atwell and go, hey, he's the reason no one takes us serious or this and that. I'm sorry. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I want the freedom of thought to think of these things and consider the ideas, even though I may not agree with all the ideas. I still think he has some very good points that need to be considered, in my opinion. Like, why does the coming of Jesus somehow happen right there? It's supposed to, at least, according to the Gospels. Here's the signs of the coming of Son of Man, and here's the temple's going to fall, this, that. It's talking about the war. Okay, we all know that. That's how we know it's written after in many ways. But his coming is supposed to be with that. So if his coming is with that, well, how did he come? He damn sure didn't show up. Nobody wrote about it. But Josephus makes it clear, hey, I saw these armies in the skies. Hey, the Messiah is Vespasian. Titus, he came and won. I don't know. I could be off my rocker. I could be mistaken. I could be 100%, but I'm not closed off to it. I can tell you that much. So I know that's not dying and rising God stuff, but it's freedom of thought, man, to think these things and not be judged. And I think that's why Myth Vision is we do what we do. Is too often programs wouldn't host someone like Atwell probably, or someone wouldn't host other people who have a Flavian concept.
It's like Price says, why not let 100 flowers bloom? Even the scientific method, works by developing various hypotheses. That's the only way we're going to make any kind of new discoveries. And in the end, maybe these things will bear themselves out. Maybe they'll be backed by good evidence and argumentation, or maybe they won't.
Yep.
It's sort of like natural selection in a way. But, unless you are a fundamentalist or an evangelical, you really shouldn't object to developing these alternative ways of seeing things. Price is great when it comes to touching on this very topic, about just developing different models, applying them, and just see how they work. Maybe it will, maybe it won't.
Yeah.
But, that's what free inquiry is all about.
Dude, he wrote that article back in the day. Not an article. He wrote a review. And his thoughts of Joseph Atwell were not pretty. Okay, back in the day. Not at all. Well, until recent history, he has retracted that kind of idea on Atwell, even though he doesn't agree with a lot of it. He has become more sympathetic toward the idea that there may be some possible, he doesn't say it is, possible validity. And he also has done that with the Creating Christ book, where these guys believe that, hey, look, there's more political implications to the New Testament than you would think. Whereas Rome would conquer a people and assimilate, or the Greeks, they would take the Egyptian god of Apis and Osiris and Serapis. Oh, crap. So we have a Serapis developed religion. Well, what if Jesus is just a Judaism and their blend of pagan deities, which mimesis criticism, in my opinion, would be an interesting thing to see how the Gospels literally are a recreation, a better version of Odysseus, of course, and the gods, Zeus and Hercules, and literally Jesus does everything better than them. No joke. When you watch it, you go, holy crap, man. When he tries to calm the storm, Odysseus prays, okay? And I don't even know if the God listened in the account that it parallels to the storm where Jesus is sleeping, and the gospel and the disciples are like, we're going to die. And like, they're freaking out. Jesus wakes up and he goes, do you have that little faith? Storm, calm down. And it literally calms down. In that story, for example, he does exactly what the gods did in the other story. And in some cases, this is how far the writers of the Gospels went. In some cases, they even make Jesus not only equal and do the power of the gods, they make Jesus make the gods look bad, because he does the more merciful, kind thing. Rather than killing the enemy, he legitimately shows mercy on the enemy, which is weird, because that's not a Jewish idea, in my opinion. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, but when you read the Old Testament, man, you see like fire, brimstone, like hardcore on the enemies of God. But if you look at stuff like Julius Caesar, and I only throw this out there because there's possible avenues in this vein. Julius Caesar showed mercy to his enemies. He literally forgives his enemies. And I don't know, but what if there's some overlap in that? I don't know. Keeping an open mind.
I don't know. Yahweh was pretty merciful in the Old Testament, wasn't he?
He wasn't even merciful on his own people, even though they were like, hey, have mercy on us, oh God. And David, have mercy.
Hey, I don't know if that Eminem song that you don't want to mess with Shady. I always sing, you don't want to mess with Yahweh because Yahweh will fucking kill you.
Yes.
Yeah. That the whole calming the storm thing, that was a very Hellenistic motif. You had that with I think Pythagoras and Empedocles as well. And what you're talking about, that sort of competitive assimilation, is something that's very well touched on by M. David Litwa in a work called Iusus Deus, the ancient depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean god. And my article very much relies on and is influenced by his work as well. And he talks about that. A lot of these you'll find these various differences between the pagan stories and the Christian stories, precisely because what the Christians were doing is, yes, they were assimilating this stuff, but they were showing why their God, Jesus, was actually better. Mm-hmm. So, you had, of course, all these miraculous or divine conceptions and so forth, where, I think it was Zeus, it was Perseus was the offspring of Zeus and a mortal woman, what was her name, Danae, who had been a virgin until, of course, Zeus came down upon her in the form of a golden shower and impregnated her that way, and therefore Perseus was the offspring of a high god and a mortal woman. You have various others of these kinds of stories, but the apologists say, but see, those weren't virgin births per se, because the woman who had previously been a virgin did have some form of sexual interaction with the deity, and so there's therefore no case for comparison. Well, the hell there's not. It's still some kind of demigod or divinity who's the offspring of a high god and a mortal woman. Mm-hmm. Only in the case of Christianity, they make it somehow purely a virgin birth, because there was just the foreshadowing of the Holy Spirit, or so to speak. And again, when we talked about the dying and rising gods, most of them, they may have some kind of Romulus or Hercules or even Osiris. Of course, they'll make an appearance to their followers after they've been raised, but they for the most part, they once they're bodily raised, they are simply taken up to heaven to be among the gods, which was seems to have been the earliest depiction of Jesus' resurrection. But later, he is made to actually
walk on the road,
do one better, and he actually comes back and visits people and makes appearances physically before he ascends to heaven. These were different ways of just they were competitive assimilation, competitive assimilation, taking these pagan stories but improving on them, making their God do one better, to say our God Jesus he's the real deal. He's the I don't know, the cream of the crop. I don't.
And they do it to the Old Testament too. So what I find funny is like people who want to make continuity, like strict continuity, like the New Testament truly is this continuation of Old Testament ideas. It's truly like, I don't think they realize that, and I think Jews do catch this. I think Jews a lot of times read and they recognize they're just trying. It's literally not. Like I've had Rabbi Tovia Singer, and of course he's Orthodox Jewish, but there are others that I've talked to that go, listen, this Christian thing is kind of a mockery to Judaism, honestly. It's an elbow, it's an offshoot, it's nothing in the vein of like strict Old Testament ideas. And Jesus himself he literally outdoes not only these other deities from other gods that we can clearly show with mimesis criticism, like they show parallels of these other stories. He does the same thing to the Old Testament character. He literally, the same way like the Gospel of Luke takes a crap on Matthew, Mark, and John, by saying this is the best gospel. Okay. That's exactly what Jesus does to the entire Old Testament. He's like, literally, oh, Elijah did that. Watch this. Moses did that. Watch
Right.
this. I can do better. And it literally makes him the, like you said, cream of the crop.
Anything you can do, I can do better.
Exactly. Yeah. And he literally ones up everyone and everything. And people will go, well, not necessarily, but I think you're right. I think you're right, bro. And this whole dying and rising God theme, I found ideas of dying and rising God in Joseph's story, but it's not necessarily like the story doesn't say dead and then rose, but the concept. He gets, Dr. Price and I wrote an article that's going to be in the Journal of Higher Criticism called Osiris, Jesus, and Joseph. And
yeah,
Joseph was thrown into a pit, of course, and he equates the pit as death. But I would also suggest, of course, that is easy to see that would be death. And that could easily be what that is. I would also suggest, though, that the death in the narrative could also be him in the dungeon, okay, where he gets sold by his brother Judah. Judah is the one who comes up with the idea in the Genesis narrative of Genesis 38. They sell him off to the whatever they are. They go into Egypt. Potiphar's wife. He's in charge of the dungeon. Two guys have a dream. One's a wine bearer. One's a baker. Literally, like, he's like, I can interpret this dream. He tells him in 3 days, your head's coming off and the birds are going to eat you. And the other one, he's like, look, you're going to be back where you were with Pharaoh. And when the guy goes back in 3 days, he's like, don't forget about me, which is do this in remembrance of me. Because I can see the sacrament there. The one guy's the bread, he's baker, and the other guy's the wine, the blood. And there's the flesh and the blood. And then, hey, don't forget about me. Do this in remembrance of me, Jesus said. And boom, he ascends at some point to the right hand of Pharaoh, the same way Jesus ascends to the right hand of God. That sounds to me very resurrection type language in a way in the narrative, but it's super disguised. Whereas it's clear in the story of Jesus or Osiris, they died. And then they're risen again. So,
yeah, a lot of you can tell a lot of what they've done is they've taken various stories that were just were widely known, and they've taken the elements and just sort of rearranged things to make it suit, what I mean, whatever the message was for that particular story. And that you remind me, one of the things I talk about in this article as well, because I feel like we can only just kind of skim the surface of it.
mm-hmm.
You'll find there's a lot of sources in that article. There's a lot of things that I draw upon, but not just Hellenization, actually having a major impact on Jews of the first century, like Philo of Alexandria or Paul of Tarsus, very much a Hellenized Jew. I think you have to be sticking your head in the historical sands not to actually acknowledge that. But even before then, I talked, of course, about Persian Zoroastrianism. Let's talk about Baal among the Canaanites. That's a culture that obviously had a major impact on the Bible, especially the Old Testament, because let's face it, the Israelites were simply an indigenous clan of Canaanites to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great work by Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, The Bible Unearthed. And this has been verified by various other archaeologists and historians who talk about the fact that, there's a lot of stuff when I began studying this stuff, Derek, I just kind of took for granted. Even though I was skeptical of Christianity, I assumed there was probably still an exodus from Egypt, conquest of Canaan, and so forth. Turns out not even those stories are true. That, the Israelites were essentially just this indigenous tribe of Canaanites all along. Was after, I guess, the fall of, the ancient Dark Ages or whatsoever. I can barely speak.
It's okay. Yeah, you're fine.
My first time doing this in a while, guys. By the way, vaping's good for you. No, they talk about how the fall of the Canaanite city states, that there sort of emerged this new culture and this new identity within the Canaanite peoples, and of course, one of those was the Israelites. The Canaanite religion and mythology and so forth was part of their heritage. So of course you see these like the Old Testament god El or Elohim or El Elyon. That was the chief Canaanite god. He had, I guess, 70 sons. Yahweh and Baal were among them. There's a great passage in Deuteronomy where it's very implicit there that Yahweh was one of the sons of El. Later on, they were simply merged for the sake of streamlining the pantheon and introducing monotheism, the worship of just one God, or monolatry, if you want to get technical about it, worship of one God among many.
Mm-hmm.
But you see the impact of Canaanite religion and mythology. I have a great book called the Archaeological Study Bible, which was actually published by Zondervan. And there are various articles, even in this apologetic work, that have to more or less admit some of this stuff. We see, I think it's John Day in Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan. He discusses the impact of the Baal myth on various Old Testament passages, like in Hosea and so forth. You see that Yahweh was the cloud rider, just like Baal was the storm god who rode among the clouds and so forth. Hosea's sort of allusion to resurrection, very likely informed by the myth of Baal. And then of course Hosea was what came to inform the other resurrection passages in the Old Testament too, which are few, but you have, I think, Isaiah 26:19 and Daniel verse 12, or chapter 12 verse 2. Canaanite culture and the myth of Baal is already sort of interlaced within so many of these Old Testament passages, these works in the Hebrew Bible. Is it any surprise that Baal, who was the son of El, or son of God, who was vanquished death, the death monster Mot, and was raised from the dead, the risen son of El, who ruled henceforth as this sort of messianic figure who saw peace and prosperity from henceforth. Any coincidence that Jesus has many of these same mythological archetypes or motifs? Probably not. So when we talk about Baal or Osiris or any of these ancient pagan figures, a lot of apologists try to suggest that these are figures that are just that it's so far-fetched, because these are figures that are so far removed from history, from these alien, distinct cultures, exotic faiths. No, they weren't. This stuff was well known to many Jews of the times. They were popular for centuries. So this is stuff that would have been very well known to them. The same with Osiris. Egypt ruled Canaan from, I think, 16th to the 11th centuries BC. We're talking about half a millennium.
Mm.
Still find ancient Egyptian artifacts, even statuettes of Osiris in the Levant. He was known there, absolutely. And even the Archaeological Study Bible talks about, I think it's Psalm 78, that the narrative with God and David as his earthly regent very distinctly parallels a similar narrative about Osiris and Horus. Again, Osiris was known to many Jews of the time. It shouldn't come as any surprise. These were not
Right.
alien, distant cultures. And of course, you had, Canaan, Israel, Palestine was sort of, it was located there, sort of right within the trade routes of these various other countries and civilizations: the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Mesopotamians, and the Egyptians as well. There's no reason to think that this stuff was just completely alien or foreign to them. It was not.
That's the problem. That's the problem I'm finding, is some of these guys will suggest that these gods, ideas, concepts, these different religious, cultural deities, Baal, Osiris, Moloch, whatever, they need to be contemporaneous, absolutely contemporaneous to the Jesus movement. So, for example, they would not. They did. I've heard this from Christopher Hansen and others, and I haven't done a lot of reading on this, but they act as though if it's not like pertinent and relevant, contemporaneous, exactly at the time of Jesus, it weakens the argument of trying to say these are utilized. Unlike where Dr. Price is like, look, this stuff, this Osiris story, these Greek and Roman, they are absolutely pertinent, and it is in the air everywhere. And so it's not like this was like, oh, well, because Osiris is a 2,000-year-old story, there's no relevance to it here in the first century. It's almost like they would say, hey, if we're going to make an argument, we have to look at like dying Caesar with his cremation and ascension to heaven, or we have to look at Apollonius of Tyana because he somehow parallels somewhere around the same time as Jesus, or you need to look at sources like Philo because it has to be right there in that time. If it's not in that time, don't use it. Well, that's misunderstanding that there may be serious influence of these other stories current in that time. No matter how old they are, they might still be alive and well and used in the culture, like you said, that developed Christianity from the start, which I find amazing.
I'm so glad you brought up that point because that is precisely what they would argue. That is precisely how they would object to this. They'd say, okay, maybe that stuff was known to Jews, centuries beforehand, but it couldn't have been influential upon first century Jews. So it's you're wrong. It's a non-argument. Well, the fact of the matter is, Josephus actually mentions Osiris. He knew who he was. He was a first century Jew. And you have these Egyptian eschatological or end times motifs in the book of Revelation. You have the resurrection of the dead. You have the lake of fire. You have the second death, the recreation of the world. These ideas are very strongly reminiscent of ancient Egyptian eschatology. Don't ask me how it got there. The fact of the matter is, it's there. It's like picking up a can of Mountain Dew and saying, there's no yellow 5 in this. Well, it says in the bottle yellow 5. It's there. I'm sorry.
Right.
It's in there. Don't ask me how it got there, but it is there. The same thing with Baal. We have, Baal's battle with Lotan and so forth. Those sort of ancient mythic motifs or narratives are alive and well in Revelation, also. So if this stuff could have been available to the minds consciously or unconsciously of Jews during the first century writing the book of Revelation, they certainly could have been, in Paul's epistles or the Gospels as well. So that's a non-argument.
No, I totally agree with you. And I get why they're trying to be overcritical, but I think they're just overemphasizing some things and not really considering, that they might have more influence than they're giving credit. And another thing, like if the Old Testament we can find clearly does this, okay, we could show like there's borrowing. We could see that they're influenced obviously from surrounding cultures, Zoroastrianism, Egyptian mythology, you name it, Baal, Molech, whatever, even Asherah, concepts of Asherah being married to Yahweh, etc. Even though let's not go there because I like Michael G. Deaver. He does a really good job. And I think even, what is her name? She's a Methodist. She's a scholar, but she does agree that I think at one point Asherah was married to Yahweh. But anywho, the point I'm making, I guess, is if the New Testament does borrow from the Old, and it does, nobody's denying that, and the Old Testament is truly, sucking in from other cultures, how can you not say that the authors of the New Testament may not also know or may not realize, hey, by borrowing there, I'm actually taking this idea, and this idea, obviously, they would be aware maybe came from other cultures as well, or they saw this. So what gets me is that syncretism is really the core of what the New Testament is doing. It truly is a syncretistic thought where a lot of people, if you take a magnifying glass, it's really easy to see if you really want, just Judaism. Oh, wow, that's amazing. And if you do the same, if you're a Greek reader, I've heard a lot of people say when they read the New Testament, they read it in Greek, they feel like they're reading the Homeric epics. They feel like if you read it in Greek, you can almost read the pagan stories and just, oh, wow, this is 100% pagan. And you can see, what you want to see because it's there.
Because they're both there.
Yeah, they're both there.
Jewish scholars are really astute at detecting these things too. If you read like Chaim Maccabee or Samuel Samuel, Giza Vermeesh, they are particularly astute and very much a good position to be able to distinguish what's Jewish and what seems to be non-Jewish, or at least was not part of of
Later Judaism that was
conventional
developed.
Judaism of the time,
Right.
if you can even call it that, because Judaism was by no means a monolith, even in the first century. That's a whole other can of worms. But they're especially astute at picking up on this stuff. I was going to go somewhere else with that too. Oh, on in terms of Osiris, the soteriology, the idea that the resurrection of Osiris was sort of the uh, in him, in his image, ancient Egyptians, they saw the promise of their own resurrection to eternal life. And this idea that just as Christ, just as Christians are identified sort of mystically with Christ in the ritual of baptism, so too Egyptians were sort of identified ritually with Osiris via the ritual of embalmment. This sort of, as Earl Doherty calls it, this parallel interaction between the man and the god, between the devotee and the divinity. You find that very much in the ancient Egyptian sort of theology, so to speak, pertaining to Osiris. SGF Brandon writes about this, and it's brilliant. I had an apologist recently say to me that no scholar familiar with the myths of Osiris and the myths of Christ would actually make a comparison. Well, that's just not true. SGF Brandon was probably he's the best I've read. If you read the Savior God, comparative studies in the concept of salvation or types of redemption, Osiris, man, myth, and magic. He was particularly astute at recognizing these hugely coincidental similarities in terms of the soteriology, the salvation schema involved, dying and rising as the deity himself had done. And of course, there was something else you'd mentioned when we talk about syncretism. Of course, we're often talking about cultural diffusion. None of us are saying, because you find some bad stuff out there as far as comparative religion goes too.
Yes.
There are some very pseudo scholarly arguments. It's funny, I first began to learn about this stuff in the works of Acharya S, reading the Da Vinci Code, things like
Right.
that. And I was intrigued by it, but I wanted to know more. And so I read Christian apologetics as well, and found out that a lot of these arguments were bunk. But then a lot of this stuff was actually pretty legitimate. And reading scholars like Price and so forth, and actually familiarizing myself with the primary sources and reputable scholarship on the matter, a lot of the stuff I found to be legit. But we're not talking about ancient Christians picking up the gospel of the pagans,
Right.
okay, and then just copying stuff or plagiarizing the stuff verbatim. That is not remotely what we're talking about. And anyone who tries to say that is basically that's a
The
straw
straw
man,
man. Yeah.
absolute straw man argument. And that's, of course, why you don't find these stories to be, these myths and so forth, to be completely identical. As Litwis says, comparison or similarity does not assert identity.
Yeah.
Of course, it's the whole nature of influence that things are going to be changed, but you're going to be able to detect a certain sort of family resemblance, so to speak, or ideal types, as Robert Price calls it. And a lot of times this was done via cultural diffusion. Maybe there might have been Christians who'd never even heard of Baal, but naturally the sort of death and resurrection archetypes that stem from the Baal cult came via the Hebrew scriptures. That would be an example of cultural diffusion.
Yep.
Maybe some of these eschatological or end times ideas from ancient Egypt came via the Persians, who also believed in this sort of judgment, divine judgment at the end, and a lake of fire, and so
Right.
forth. That's cultural diffusion. That's exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. We're talking about things that are they're organic, they are natural. It's everything in our human everyday experience tells us that these things happen. It's inevitable. It's part of the human condition. And if you're an apologist who argues otherwise, you're just, I'm sorry, but you're not dealing with reality.
I mean, is it wrong of me to say that now that I know what I know about it, and looking at these things, there's not only freedom in that idea, but I actually, now that I've left Christianity, rather than just being a troll, like a hater of these things, knowing this actually, for me personally, makes me find beauty in it. It's like I can run to things and dude, I can poke holes. I can make fun. But like if knowing that this is history mythology, this is like how our humanity has taken amazing stories that were relevant in their time. Yes, people killed people as sacrifices to the gods, okay? Absolutely ridiculous, okay? But nonetheless, that's because we know what we know now and we live when we live now. But this is things we did. I mean, hey, the crop cycle's not coming. Go grab Jimmy. Dude, don't do that. Well, I bet you anything, bro, in 1,000 years, mark my words, this is going in history. And probably someone else has already said this shit, but I've never heard anyone else say it, but I suspect in 1,000 years, couple thousand years from now, that civilization, if it's still here, if coronavirus doesn't wipe us out, no, play.
I hope it does.
You're so silly. I suspect that our prison systems will be so barbaric of an idea to humanity in a couple thousand years from now, they will look at that as human sacrifice in a sense, because we'll know the science of understanding that isolation and the way that you think you're actually rehabilitating people by putting them in strict conditions like that. I don't want to rabbit trail into my whole personal opinion, but I do not think that it works. And I think we'll find that out, that when you kill your little kid to a god that's invisible in the sky to have crop cycle come, that also doesn't work. And then throwing them like the Aztecs did in a small pond and then drinking from the same pond also doesn't work. So we're learning as humans, but I find beauty. And I think if Christians, and it's just my heart goes out to them because I was a very, very, very fundamentalist, very hardcore believing Christian, that if they saw this and understood what we saw, the freedom of that, the beauty, and there's a connection to humanity on a whole nother level. Now I can respect you regardless of your cultural aspects, your religious ideas, whatever. Like I can now see it and go, hey, I think that's a great story, but look, you get just as much good out of that. Come watch the movie Thor with me and watch Loki. You can get Jesus Christ out of that, like let's go check him out. Just my heart goes out. That's all. Like I think there's more beauty in it now than being like so brainwashed and drinking the Kool-Aid and I'm right, you're wrong. And then outsiders, if you don't view like me, your post-mortem situation is going to be absolutely different. Like once you see these, you got to go, damn, how did I get it right? What was my luck? I think someone says like, what is the luck that I'm born at a certain time in a certain place with a certain God and it's the right God? It just, come on.
Won the cosmic lottery, so to speak.
Yeah.
No, I think it's so funny the moment you mentioned sort of seeing the beauty in all of it. Once you do recognize it for what it is and see that it is sort of this beautiful kind of patchwork quilt, this sort of melting pot. I mean, if you look at the ways that say for instance Paul of Tarsus fused a lot of these Hellenistic ideas with Jewish ideas and ideas from the Greek Old Testament and so forth, you recognize how unbelievably, just mind-bogglingly brilliant it is.
Yeah.
Say what you want about him, but the man was absolutely a genius. So the way these things are fused, there's something almost majestic about it.
Right.
But I thought it was so funny the moment you said that, because I instantly thought of Charles Darwin.
Yeah.
That was sort of the way he saw evolution. It's like, okay, maybe this is not the providence of God, but there's still, once you see what it is and once you see how it works and how it all came together, there's something majestic about this. There's something beautiful about this, and I feel the same way.
Yeah.
It is kind of the way that this all sort of merged together and developed this sort of, again, this pastiche, so to speak. There is something that you can acknowledge is amazing about it. And as Joseph Campbell could have told anyone, yeah, there is beauty in sort of the underlying message, the metaphorical wisdom of a lot of these myths as well. Take the mystery religions, or Christianity for that matter. The whole idea of dying to the old self and reemerging as something new and better and
Right.
stronger. You and I can identify with that.
Yeah.
I know we don't want to touch on that too much, but on our, past, addiction issues, substance abuse issues, and being able to overcome that, I don't think that I literally died and rose, but to see it in that sort of metaphorical light, and to understand that myths do have that kind of power, and the message, that the underlying message, the metaphorical wisdom, there absolutely is beauty in that, no doubt.
Yeah. Well, to me, it's narrative. I think someone put it boldly, like in narrative concepts, we all have a story. We love a story. Humans love a story. We love narrative. And if it can somehow apply to us, because we are creatures of selfishness, we're creatures that really enjoy it. As long as am I included in this? Oh, okay. So when we come up with a story that includes us somehow, it can be powerful. And I think there is some wisdom. I don't think anybody's discrediting that there's wisdom in there. And I'm going to say, and this is just my opinion, even the guys like Aaron Ra, the anti-theists who literally go out to poke holes at the Bible. If you had a beer with them on the side, which I don't because I don't drink anymore, but giving an example, if you hung out with these guys and you sat and talked to them, I guarantee you they'd say, hey, look, there's definitely some conventional wisdom, but there's also harmful things that don't work in this. They're not going to be fruitful in the context we live in today. So if someone comes along and says, I want to pick this, but I want to throw that out because that's not relevant. Cool. Okay. I think his mission is to get people freed from the system. But if you asked him, hey man, do you think like laying down your life for your best friend to help protect him, even if that means dying on their behalf, do you think that would be like a noble thing to do? He would absolutely. He'd go, right. Dude, that would probably be one of the greatest things you could do, is to save your kids, your wife, your friend, your family, whatever, to protect them and die in the process. That's a hero. That's a hero. And what did Joseph Campbell say? The hero with 1,000 faces. So it's like, I can jump on that. I can dig that. But don't tell me I need to call a God by name or I need to pray to this particular deity. I tend to look at humanity, and I don't have that. I take what I like and what works and what I feel, and I literally toss the rest, man, because
take the best and leave the rest.
I think, honestly, the moral principles that the biblical narrative has is, people want to say God gave these things. No, I think we implicitly as humans evolved knowing, hey, that hurt. I don't know. It's an evolved idea of morality and concepts. So we're rabbit trailing out of dying and rising gods right now. But Derek, how do people get a hold of this Dying and Rising God article? Which link do they need to go to? Is there a link?
It's actually something that's going to be published in a forthcoming anthology by John W. Loftus and Robert M. Price, called, and I hope they're okay with me mentioning this, if not, we can edit it out, but it's called Varieties of Mythicism. Just as there's, I think it was Varieties of Religious Experience that was written by, I can't think of what his name was, but it's kind of a classic, I guess. But Varieties of Jesus Mythicism, that's going to be that's the working title anyway. And the article will actually be in that anthology. And like I said, I'm sure we just scratched the surface of what's in there, but that's perfectly okay. That's all I really wanted to be able to do, and I don't mind that we got off on some of these tangents either, because they're good stuff.
You're going down in history, bro. That book's going to be fire. I already have told a few people. We've had Dr. Price on, and I'm going to have John W. Lofton on soon as well. I'm currently reading Why I'm an Atheist of his, and then he's also mailing me his big he's got another book. I got his signed version, of course. So he's sending me that, and I can't remember the name of it, but in there's the magical Jesus concept. And I want to research that because I plan on having Robert Connor come on. He's going to present his magical Jesus. I don't know if he's a historicist, but I think he is. And he thinks that if there was a historical Jesus, he was a magician, which we got to let these guys come. And guys, go support Derek. Do you have a Patreon or something where people can help support you?
I don't have a Patreon just yet. I'm just now in the process of kind of getting things rolling as far as all of my creative endeavors, and so to speak. I'd like to even begin my own YouTube channel at some point.
Please
This is a
do.
friend's equipment that I'm borrowing right now to be able to do this with you today. But
All right.
I'm kind of in the process. But you can always check out my website, my blog, atheologica.wordpress.com, also atheomedy.wordpress.com. I do have a brief sort of memoir called Addictus, A Non-Believer's Path to Recovery, which you can find either as a paperback or as an ebook on Amazon as well.
That'll be down in the description too. And if you get the YouTube channel, I'll put it down below. It won't take you
Sweet.
5 minutes to make the channel. Even if you don't have content, people
All
can
right.
subscribe so that when you do drop the content, it's nothing. If you already have a Gmail, go on YouTube and it's easy, man. Just set you up one. And then of course, anything else in the future, we'll be having you back on, of course, especially when the book
Awesome.
drops. I think we're going to have to do more shows on this.
Absolutely.
This is awesome. And then also the last thing I want to ask you is to make sure that you go ahead and die and rise again right now, because you said you would do it for everybody to prove that it's, you know, it's not that hard.
I promised, didn't I? Okay.
Yeah. Where did he go? Oh my gosh, he was dead. Oh my goodness. Are you the gardener? No, I'm just kidding.
I did it in less than 3 days.
You dude, you definitely beat it. You beat
Not
it.
on the door.
That's awesome, man. Well, thank you for joining me, man. For real, Derek Bennett, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
And don't forget, we are Myth Vision.